Alright everyone, welcome back to No Tech Drama, and as promised, following up on my video on the HP Microserver Gen 8, where I was actually talking about how to put SSD in the optical bay. I'm actually here to talk a little bit more about the HP Microserver and why I think it's a good idea to buy a dedicated server machine rather than try to build your own server machine by taking out of the shelf cases and components. So the HP Gen 8, you can find it for very good prices used because it's 2 generations behind the latest version, which is the generation 10. However, especially for a home server, you're not going to use much more than what you find in the Gen 8. Actually, as a home server, it's even have way more than you will need. But what is a good thing about using a server? Well, the thing is that the hardware is very neat. First of all, you have a very compact form factor. It's very small, and aside from being very small, you can still fit in 4 hard drives, which is great for a home server, especially if you want to do a file server, a NAS, or you want to do a Plex media server. But storage is usually one of the reasons why you want a home server. And here you see in this neat package you have actual 4 bays. And why it's cool to have the base? It's very cool because you can just remove the base from the actual Gen 8, and that is great when working on a server. My installation is running actually a Debian. Here I have the terminal now open via SSH. And what is great about having the base is that, especially when you create RAIDs, in my case I'm using ZFS, but even if you use the normal RAID from HP using the RAID controller, it's a great option to have the base. So because you can have a very small form factor computer and still have great easy access to the hard drives. You don't need to open up the case to reach the hard drives. As you can see, it's pretty crammed in there, but you can just easily access your hard drive by removing them from the cage, which is great. It's not hot swap, right? But that's okay. It's enough for your usage probably. You don't need to usually swap hot drives, and having a hot swap is very useful for enterprise or corporate environment when you don't want to have downtime. In your case, at home won't be a problem to switch off the server, exchange the drive, but at least you will just need to remove the cage and replace the hard drive without having to do much work. If you build your own computer, more likely for small form factor case, there are a lot of good choices from Fractal Design, for example, with the Node series. However, it's not as easy to access the hard drives, and hard drives is something that even if they are not failing, you more likely you are going to upgrade the hard drives the moment you are close to run out of storage. So it's one of the most common upgrade you're going to do, and it's great to have this facility, and you're not going to find this easily if you're building it yourself. Plus, you can find this for a great price, and the reason why you can find it for a great price is that most of the ones you're going to find are running an actual Celeron, right, which may be not that great. However, you can easily upgrade the CPU on the Gen 8, and in my case I'm running an i3 3220, which is a 2-core CPUs with 4 threads at 3.3 gigahertz, and is absolutely killing it. As you can see here, I have my load average is 0.03, right? So it's absolutely nothing. It's basically not using the CPU at all, which is great. So it's very easy to upgrade the CPU. And why it's so easy? Because thankfully the HP Microserver, although is a dedicated server machine, is using a standard socket, is the LGA 1155. So it's using a standard socket. You have this passive cooler, so it's very easy to just remove the cooler and install the new CPU. Now, the thing you may be worried about when installing an i3 on this, given it has a passive cooler, is about thermals, right? Because an i3 may be running hotter than a Celeron processor. Now, the stock coolers is doing a great job. Even if it's passive, it's really massive, it's really thick cooler, and you're not going to have any issue on warming down your CPU. But I'm going to talk about CPU thermals later on, because there's something interesting to know about HP Gen 8 microserver, little issue actually with the BIOS and CPU temperature monitoring. Now, what else you get by getting full-fledged hardware server machine rather than build your own? Well, you get few things, right? As you can see here, you have 1, 2, and 3 Ethernet port. Why you have 3 Ethernet port? You have 3 Ethernet port because you have 2 that are your standard Ethernet ports that you can also use in aggregation depending on the operating system and the drivers you're using. But basically, by aggregating 2 LAN ports, you can double the bandwidth of Ethernet, or you can dedicate 1 port only to downstream and 1 port only to upstream. That can be very useful if you're having very demanding bandwidth usage. Maybe you're using it for file server and you're transferring large files, so that means something you want to look at. At the moment, I'm using only 1 of the Ethernet ports, but you have a third port, and the third port is the ILO port. The ILO is an actual dedicated chipset that you can see here, the ILO chip, and the ILO is basically running a micro operating system that you can see here, that you can access via web, and is basically allow you to manage your computer. You know, for example, see, okay, the speed of the fan, see the power usage, inspect the processor, the memory, that of course is ECC, right? So is error control memory. I have 2 GB, so 16 GB, and that's not how you usually find it by default. Usually it's coming with 8 GB, but again, easily upgradable. Any DDR3 ECC module will work just fine. You have information about your networks. So basically, you're going to have access to your server. The cool thing is also that you have a remote console. Now, with the remote console, you're going to be able to having a sort of VNC section, right? Session where you connect remotely to your server. But because the ILO is actually a dedicated chip running, is actually capturing the video output of the server, and you're going to be able to administer the server through a Java applet, which means that you have access to the server even at the BIOS level. So you can shut down your machine, you can turn on your machine remotely. It doesn't need to be on, right? Obviously need to be plugged into a power outlet, but you're going to have access to your machine even when it's turned off, because this little boy here, this little chipset, is completely separated from the rest of your components and completely independent from your operating system. So it's going to give you access to your server at any time. So that's something very cool. You may not use this as often, but when you need it, you're going to be glad that you have the option, right? Okay, so you can see here now, this is my server, and okay, you may not be now blown away because as well I can do that with VNC, true. However, as you can see here in the power switch, well, you don't see that now in OBS, unfortunately, but by clicking on power switch, I can actually press and hold the power switch. So if the system, for example, is completely hanged and not responding, you can still remotely simulating the fact that you are pressing and holding the power button, even if you are, you know, in Australia and your server is back home in Spain, whatever, right? You're going to be able to actually turn it off remotely, and remotely you're going to be able to turn it on and access not only the operating system, but the actual BIOS, and that's great thing, especially when things are not working as expected. So let me get rid of this anyway. I don't want to go too much into the weeds. So the few advantage that we say was to have a dedicated server hardware is you have dedicated chipset for remote management with this dedicated LAN port. You have easy access to hard drives, which is absolutely a great thing, especially when working with RAID storage and upgrading drives on the fly. And what else you get is you get, well, a PCIe slot, which accept low profile graphic card. You're not going to be able to recycling easily whichever graphic card you have at hand. It needs to be a low profile one. It needs to be low profile also on the actual PCI bracket on the back, right? So it needs to be a shorter GPU. The only drawback maybe of this version of the server is that it's only coming with a VGA port, right? And also, even if you're going to use an i3 browser, you're not going to be taking advantage of the integrated GPU, as the server is only outputting video through the VGA and is using his own chipset for that, which is a Maxtor crappy graphic card, right? But if you really need something that is graphically intensive, you still have the option to install a low profile graphic card, such as, for example, a GTX 730 or something on those lines. So the only thing that you may be worried about when you're upgrading the CPU is temperatures, because here in the overview, in the system information, you have a very fancy information about the temperature. There are multiple sensors. This will be the back of the PC, and this will be the front. So here you are kind of like your intake reading 18 degrees and is exhausting at 42 degrees. So fairly good. And if we check our CPU, is actually running at 40 degrees. But does it? Because if we actually check on the server itself via a sensors command, we see that the actual CPU is way cooler than 40 degrees. It's running at 29 degrees, right? So great. An i3, okay, the computer is now not under load, is idling, so that's okay. But as you can see here, is reporting 40C, and all the time you're going to see the temperature here, you're always going to see 40C. So you need to be a little bit conscious about this, right? Because it's not a huge issue, because the stock cooler is keeping the CPU cool, but it may be an issue because if your temperature increase on the CPU, the system may not pick it up correctly. Now this seems to happen as well with the included Celeron CPU, so it doesn't seem to be an issue with the i3, but an issue with the actual BIOS of HP. Now, to prove you that I'm not lying to you, if I put the CPU under stress, for example by starting mining, Zcash. Okay, so Zcash now is starting and is starting to mine. So if we are watching the uptime, we can see that our load average should actually now be increasing because it will start to mine. So 0.16, 0.23. So the computer is actually increasing its load, right? Because we are mining at the moment 0.45. So according to ILOG, our temperature is still 40 degrees, but we know that more likely it's lying. And if we are actually watching the sensors, we actually see that our cores are 31 degrees and 43 degrees. And actually, the whole package is 37. Now it's up to 42. But here, as you can see, it's still lying to us and still telling us that it's 40 degrees, right? So here is going up 43, 37, 42, but here is absolutely always going to be standard at 40. So this is the only thing that I think is not great of the Gen 8 microserver, including some issues with the booting. If you use an optical drive, you can see my other video about the SSD mounted in the optical drive, and I talk about booting from the SATA 5 port and which issues you're going to have. The main issue I have now with this setup is about not having correct readout on the temperatures, but you know, I know that by monitoring through sensors directly in Linux that the CPU is anyway staying within acceptable ranges. Even under load is anyway not normally exceeding the 60 degrees, so it's fine. But just be aware that you cannot fully trust this when it's come to the CPU temperature. So it was quite a long video and not scripted at all, so I hope it wasn't too boring to watch. I'm going to make some new videos now for the year, and I'm excited to have reached and actually surpassed 100 subscribers. So thank you very much for following me, and I hope that this video was useful to you and make you think about start to consider to buy an actual true server machine rather than build your own. Thank you everyone, and see you in the next one.